Well, hello, LifeSite friends. It is a special honor to be with you on this day. For our Canadian viewers, of course, today is Canada Day, and this is Independence Day weekend in the United States of America. And you know what? There is no better people to talk to today about the subject of freedom and the enslavement of communism than Cuban Americans. And we are so honored right now to welcome my good friend Orlando Guttierrez, and alongside him is Luis Zuniga-Rey, who spent many years in Cuban prisons. Orlando, it is so good to see you again, my friend, joining us now from the Directorio in Miami.
Well, it's great to be in the show. It's a privilege, and it's great to see you again, Jim. And I want to thank you for the support and the service you've given to the cause of freedom for the Cuban people over the years.
Yes, Orlando, I know that this is a cause that you've really just dedicated your life to. Back when we worked together 20 years ago in Washington, when President Carter was going out to Cuba, and of course we know that that Fidel Castro cracked down even harder after Carter went, and then just recently, last year, Cubans revolted. There was a further crackdown, and you actually have some news to share with us today about some pretty big news that the regime is still cracking down.
Well, Jim, I think the most important thing is the context.
Yep.
About a year ago, the Cuban people rose up against the communist regime in Cuba.
Yep.
Simultaneously, across the island, thousands of people went out into the streets demanding freedom, demanding democracy, demanding change. They didn't ask to leave the country. They didn't ask for more food, although the Cuban people were hungry, especially spiritually hungry. They asked for freedom, for change. Since that date, since those days of outright rebellion against the regime, a lot has changed in Cuba. And another significant thing that has happened is that 20 Cuban generals have died in less than a year in Cuba. That's very strange to happen anywhere, but especially in a country like Cuba with such a hermetic, secretive regime. Now, today's news is huge. General Lopez Callejas was the man in charge of the money, of the finances, of the armed forces in Cuba, and also the man in charge of the finances of the Castro family. He was widely viewed as a possible president in Cuba eventually, a man with a great deal of power who managed his company as a fiefdom. So in any communist regime, when the death of an official like this is announced so suddenly due to a heart attack, they're saying, and in the context that I'm explaining of national rebellion and the deaths of so many other generals, this may be a very clear indication of the internal power struggles in the regime.
And so what would be the significance of this, Orlando, and what is it? I mean, this is not a story you're going to hear on any mainstream media in America. What do you think is actually going on?
What I think is actually going on is similar to what happened in the Soviet Union in its last days. The death of key individuals like Brezhnev, like Chernenko, like Andropov, which ushered in an age of change. Lopez Calleja was a lot younger than these Soviet hierarchs. He was he was a relatively young man by the standards of Cuban power in his 60s, and his death is very significant because of the way it was announced, of what it means for the regime, but also because the key man in the financial sector is no longer there, and the regime will be hard pressed to find someone who can replace him in the context of the economic crisis the regime is living through, and of the international sanctions which have been levied against the regime.
Yeah, Luis, again, thank you so much, sir. I know you suffered for many years in Castro's gulag. Can you give us a sense of what life is like in Cuba today, sir?
Yes, indeed. Most of what we have been seeing in the last year is just the outcome of 63 years of disasters, but now it has come to a point of no return. I think that the regime has a political, economic, social, and even migratory crisis. For instance, the regime has lost most of its main sources of income. They have lost the export of physicians, physicians that were exploited because around 90% of their wages were confiscated by the regime. They have lost the contracts in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Bolivia. They have lost a lot of contracts in Africa. So it has been a huge blow for the regime. Secondly, the tourist industry. It has been because of the pandemic issues around the world and in Cuba particularly. So no more income from tourism. Remittances from Cubans all over the world to sustain their families in Cuba has reduced a lot because there is a economic crisis in most countries around the world too. So the regime has no solution. The regime is desperate. Particularly when all the production machinery in the island has collapsed. They have produced nothing. They keep no maintenance of any industry. You can see now with the collapse in the electric supply industry. Most of the thermoelectrics in Cuba are all the Soviet era. They have no maintenance for those old age technologies. And so what we are seeing in Cuba is a complete collapse. And the people is tired out of being requested sacrifices. They keep fighting for the revolution. And the revolution is a total disaster. Only the elite have a good living. All the people are real poor and living in desperate. And you can see it through the migration waves that we have seen in the last few months.
Yes, thank you, sir. Orlando, I've been out covering a lot of the stories surrounding the overturning of Roe v. Wade. You know that we are a Christian news organization here. That's why LifeSite News was founded. And I've been around a lot of young people who were ranting and raving about that decision, and they now fly their communist flags. They're talking about all the reasons why America should become communist, and I think that they don't get to hear from people like Luis often enough about the horrors, about what communism is actually about. I mean, what would be your message to all Americans now who seem to be so enamored with socialism, in contrast to the reality of the misery, the pain and suffering, and the enslavement that the Cuban people have been suffering from for 60 years?
Well, I think there's a very important book called The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek.
Yep.
And it very clearly explains what happens when a group of unelected bureaucrats gain total control over the economy and decide who lives and who dies. And particularly when this group of unelected bureaucrats has no ethical framework to guide or to substantiate their actions. That's at the very minimum, at the very least. That is a communist state. If on top of that uncaring bureaucracy, you add self-serving families or a self-serving leader who has no respect for people and has no respect for the inherent dignity of human beings, then you have a disaster. What does that disaster look like? In the case of Cuba, it looks like a huge decrease and collapse of food production. A country that fed itself and exported food to the US until 1959, today has to import 85% of what it eats. And it's not due to the embargo, because the embargo doesn't cover food. The US embargo does not cover food or medicine. It has to do with the economic policies imposed by that bureaucracy to control the population. And number two is population collapse. Cuba is the only Latin American country with a negative birth rate. Every year there are fewer Cubans. Why is that? Well, number one, because people migrate. They don't want to live in a place where they can't think, they can't speak, they can't produce on their own. They're restricted in everything they do. It has to do with the fact that every year there are fewer births in Cuba because people don't want to bring their children into the world in a place where there's so much repression. It has to do with the fact that for years, the regime in Cuba pushed abortion as a type of birth control, seriously affecting our population growth. And you need population growth to maintain a standard of living, a level of acceptable existence in any country. And also, it has to do with the fact, which has been clearly shown and demonstrated, that Cuba is the Latin American country with the highest suicide rate. So why are the Cuban people who are such a hardworking people, a joyous people, a joyful people, people who have excelled throughout their history, why are they dying? They're dying because they have no freedom, and because the policies implemented by this regime affect the very sustainability of life in the island. That is the truth about Cuba.
Yep. Well, Luis, we know that the regime cracked down brutally after the people rose up last year. Do you think, sir, that there is any chance that there will be a successful, real revolution of the Cuban people who are just dying to reclaim their dignity, sir?
Yes, indeed. Please keep into account that when the people spontaneously went out on the streets last July 11 by thousands, even though they were hungry, they did not claim or ask for food. Even though they did not have medicine, there's a severe scarcity of medicine in Cuba, they did not request medicine. They requested one thing, freedom, end of a communist regime, because they know that the solution for all the evils, all the problems in Cuban life is the system, the communist, the socialist regime, which is impoverished the Cuban population. Cuba was extremely successful economically and socially before the communist revolution, and now Cuba has been brought back to the 20th century, the beginnings of 20th century. So the level of poverty, misery is horrible. But above all, for me personally, the destruction of human dignity is the most damaging thing in Cuba. First of all, the communist regime attacked the civil society as we know it. The institution in civil society as we know it, for instance, in the United States, we have government on one side, but you have also different non-governmental institutions. You have professional associations, we have private businesses, we have institutions caring for the poor, for the needy, for ladies, for mothers needing assistance. But when a communist country, when a communism take over society, they obliterate all those independent organizations of civil society, and government take control of everything, not just not the political sphere, but also the economy, the society, and particularly education. They attack education because they want to destroy the basic of society, family. And that's the core, because the government wants to take control of every individual, and to do it, they have to destroy family, the cell of society.
Well, thank you for saying that, sir. I mean, that is a foundation, bedrock communism, that it goes after the church, it goes after the family. They propagandize through education. We hear Americans saying all the time, oh, Cubans get free education, they get free health care. Well, what a bunch of nonsense that is, because they're actually waging war on their own people. In Orlando, this is something we see in America, where we've had public school districts teaching critical race theory, teaching them to hate America, that our founding fathers were just nothing but a bunch of racist, sexist, selfish people. What is your message, Orlando, to Americans who, as we celebrate our independence this weekend, about why we cannot embrace any form of socialism?
In the United States, we have achieved the level of quality of life we have because of the freedoms we enjoy. It comes from there. Our commitment to freedom is the basis of our division of powers. It's the basis of a society where things are debated and talked about and then resolved in a civilized manner. And that has made America an exceptional experiment in human history. It's made it a prosperous nation, first of all, spiritually and also materially. To hand over our rights and our liberties to an unelected bureaucracy and to ideologues who dream of a utopia where personal freedom and individual freedom don't exist is suicide. We can't do that as a nation. It's fine to be Republican, Democrat, whatever, libertarian, whatever political tendency you may have, but don't surrender the freedom to be that. That happened in Cuba. That's happened in Venezuela. And societies that were prosperous, that were industrious, that of course had imperfections, but instead of correcting those imperfections through a democratic process, they believed that a dictatorship could correct them, resulted in the kind of disaster we're seeing in those countries. So although it seems far-fetched in the US, it's not. And our federalism, our division of powers, all these, our electoral college, all these institutions set up to protect our individual freedom from the corruption of the desire of absolute power are absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm. Luis, you suffered 14 years in Castro's gulags where you were tortured and, of course, sent to prison without a fair trial, of course. Can you give us an idea of how many political prisoners there are in Cuba today, or do we even have a number, sir?
There have been thousands of political prisoners every time during 63 years of communist dictatorship in the island. Different years have been different number of prisoners depending on the crisis of a regime, because when the regime feels that the control of the power is at risk, they immediately increase repression. So it's oscillating the amount of political prisoners. Now, just for the protests that took place in Cuba last year, there were over 1,400 people arrested and over 900 that has been taken to court and tried, and huge sentences. Unbelievable. People just protesting peacefully and just demanding freedom and the end of a communist system were sentenced to prisons of 10 years, 15 years, and even 20 years without any violence or any evidence for actions that were causing damage even to civil social properties. But around there are now, for instance, in prison, people who have been in prison for close to 35 years, close to 40 years now in prison. So it's abusive. It's a system designed to control, to put under control everyone, and whoever resists that control, it should be sent to prison for re-education. They must be turned as obedient people obedient to the dictates of a regime. And when they refuse, as we did in prison, they put us under torture, solitary confinement for 7-10 years. I lived in steel cells for 7 years continuously because they wanted to bend me down, and as well as me, hundreds of political prisoners, plantados, as we were called, because we refused re-education. We refused to resign, to relinquish our hopes of freedom, democracy, and a free Cuba.
Sir, how are you able to get through that? What sustained you?
One thing: the Lord, God, belief, faith. Those political prisoners that were most religious, that held the most faith in ourselves, were the ones that able to go through all that agony in prison and come out mentally safe, mentally healthy, because there were many political prisoners that unfortunately they relinquished, they lost most of her hope for life, they lost most of her expectancy for future or future a better life, and so they had depressions, they had problems. They came out of prison with many psychological and mental problems because of those sufferings, those tortures, and those abuses. Because it were not only the isolation of a prison, it was also beatings. You never know if you will be alive next day. So it was an agony. And remember that communist countries follow a maximum thought of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, which says, to your enemy, re-educate politically them. And if they refuse to be re-educated, destroy them. And that's what they tried to do, and they did, in part, with political prisoners not accepting re-education.
Yep. Orlando, can you give us an idea of the state of the Catholic Church in Cuba?
It's a church that's growing. The Christian church overall is growing in Cuba. There's a spiritual awakening in Cuba. This growth is seen in the Catholic Church, and it's also seen in the evangelical churches. There is a grassroots movement of spiritual awakening taking place in the island. And it's very beautiful to watch it. There is repression against the Christian religion. In the case of the Catholic Church, it's more sophisticated, but it can also be very overt. In the case of the evangelical churches, there's closing of temples, destruction of homes where religious meetings are taking place. There are a few churches controlled by the regime, which serve as spokespieces for the regime, but they're not significant in numbers. The Catholic Church in Cuba has generated many strong leaders for democracy, such as Osvaldo Payá, who was murdered by the regime, with another Catholic leader, Harold Cepero, a few years back. And especially this year, we have seen priests and nuns take a very prominent position in defense of the people and against repression. There are priests who are writing, who are publishing their thoughts on the state of repression in Cuba. The Mother Superior of the Daughters of Charity, who is based in Cuba, she has taken a very outspoken position in defense of the people. She issued a public document about a week ago calling on Cubans to resist the regime because they cannot tolerate what they're being forced into. So I would say that the church in Cuba is a living church. It's an active church with a new generation of priests, nuns, and lay people who are out there with the majority of Cubans facing all types of repression and demanding change.
Yep. Well, Orlando and Luis, thank you so much for sharing your hearts with us today. And know that all of our viewers, I'm going to ask them right now to be praying for all God's blessings upon the work you do at the Directorio. And for the Cuban people are enslaved. 11 million people that have been enslaved for 63 years. All this nonsense that we hear about, Cuba being a great travel destination now and all those kind of things, don't believe it. These men right here are testimony that is a lie. Communism is a lie. The Castro regime is a lie. And brothers, we're just going to continue to pray that the Cuban people will know freedom someday.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Glad to be on this program.
Yeah. So good to see you again, Orlando. Luis, thank you, sir. Thank you for your words of encouragement. God bless you, sir. And may you both enjoy Independence Day weekend in the United States of America this weekend.
God bless America.
God bless America, and God bless you too, Jim.
Thank you, gentlemen. Bye-bye.